Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We're looking at Imam Ghazali's definition of and classification of reason, different types of reason, and we are up to the fourth type now, fourth and the last one in this classification. Before that, we looked at three classifications. The third one was experience, life experience. So reason in the sense of life experience. The second one was reason in the sense of necessary knowledge. And the first one was the basic meaning of reason, reason as a power, or reason as a faculty. And now we are up to the last type, and this last type all goes back to the notion of power. So if we just to go back a bit, so we have an overall viewpoint in our mind. So far the classification is like that: al-aql, or reason, reason is a power or faculty reason is a power through which we are able to acquire mediated knowledge. And this knowledge can be theoretical, that is related to the objects around the world, and it can be practical, related to the social world or even the psychological world. So that's the basic meaning of so the first definition of reason is a power to help us to acquire knowledge. And this is a power of either ourself or mind, whatever you want to call it. And so this is the basic, and this knowledge is the mediated knowledge. But for mediated knowledge, you can't have mediated knowledge without basic data. And that basic information must come through non-mediated sources, according to this conception. Intuitive knowledge, it must be intuitive, otherwise we would have infinite the regress. And this non-mediated knowledge was divided into two types: first, which we acquire through this power, and the other, which is included in the structure of reason itself. So basic that without that we can't even think of this power. So reason is power which is partially constituted by a specific structure, and that specific structure gives us intuitive knowledge, through which we can acquire intuitive knowledge either through this reason or through help from senses. So that's first and third definition is covered here. And the second one was, but you still need life experience in journal to contextualize this power. So that was the third definition of reason. So that's how much we have covered so far. And the fourth one sort of is not something new, as we'll see, but it's more like a maturation of this basic power, and it's strengthening vis-a-vis our desires, etc. So today we will look at that, inshallah. Now the fourth aspect or fourth type of reason is the reason which Imam Ghazali defines as والرابع أن تنتهي قوة تلك الغريزة إلى أن يعرف عواقب الأمور. So this power becomes so strong that it is able to see the consequences, not just the immediate consequences of the things and actions and plans, but also their long-term consequences. So this type is more related to action in a sense, although it's not limited to action, but at least it can be understood more readily when we concentrate on action, human action. And the source of human action, or if we contrast two elements in the nature of human being, the element of animality and the other non-animal element, or the specifically human element. So this fourth and the last type in this classification is related to the dialectical relationship between these two elements. So we'll try to understand them first through focusing on the concept of action, and the second through contrasting two elements within human beings we just mentioned. Okay, so if we focus on action, the source of human action is human body, and human body is the animal side of humans. And our actions are built on desires. In a sense, our body is the collection of desires. And through desires, so body has certain needs, but beyond needs, body has desires. And those desires, needs and desires both, but since desire cover needs as well, that's why I'll just focus on desire. Desire spur or instigate action. So you feel the desire for food and then you grab food. Okay, so that's one. But the human element, so the body, desires, actions. And obviously the basis of it is needs. So you need to fulfill those needs, otherwise your body won't be able to sustain itself or survive. But desires are on top of the needs, and they are the basis of human creativity, human, dynamism and all those. So they are great. Desires are great bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. So desires is urge for transcendence, in the sense that an urge for fulfillment beyond the fulfillment of the basic need. So that's the transcendence of your basic needs. And these desires instigate different type of actions. And whenever these desires instigate action, we can use part of our reason to find the best way to satisfy those desires. So that can be one function of reason. And reason is this non-animal part, or part of reason is non-animal part. And this non-animal part really comes to forth when reason sometimes tells us, so there is a desire, there is instigation, and that could possibly lead to action, but before it does, reason stops it, put hold to it, and say whether should I do this or not. So this putting limit to, temporary or permanent limit to certain desire, this is specifically a uniquely human thing, and it's basis of all morality. So that's why if there's an ideology which in principle says that all desires should be fulfilled, and that's our human right, then that ideology basically denies morality, because the very conception of morality is based on this ability to put a stop to certain desires for certain reasons. Those reasons can be correct, those reasons can be incorrect. But this power, which has ability to question our desires, and in consequence the ability to put hold on certain desires, stop certain desires, delay certain desires, is a uniquely human ability and power. And Imam Ghazali says that this is the fourth type of reason. So this is the fourth type of reason. The fourth type of reason is the conception of reason as a power. So our basic, so reason is a power, basic power, but that basic power, when it matures, through education, through training, and the heart of that is a family, and then your maktab and all those things, you develop this power into a practical reason which is able to distinguish between and by practical I mean here practical is anything which is related to freedom, power, develops into practical reason which has ability to differentiate between ability to question desires, put some desires on hold, permanent or temporary, and eventually evaluate desires and let some desires fulfill, some desire keep unfulfilled, either permanently or temporarily, due to a variety of reasons. Those reasons can be moral as well as disciplinary. Those reasons can be practical, etc. But this is a power, and it is a specifically human power. Imam Ghazali call it the fourth type of reason. We can call it practical reason. It's different from the third type of practical reason we did. That is more to do with experience rather than. So this is practical reason in a Kantian sense, and the third one was practical reason more in an Aristotelian sense. Okay, and as we'll see, this power is based on the ability to differentiate between two types of consequences. Differentiate between two types of consequences. Immediate and long term. So one of the reasons you might want to stop the some desires or put some desires on hold, because you can see that although immediate consequences are, satisfaction and pleasure and all that, long-term consequences are misery, pain, and all that. So long-term misery and pain outweigh immediate satisfaction and pleasure. That's why you don't act on the instigation of certain desires. But this taming of desires, or putting them on hold, or just delaying certain desires, or reducing certain desires, or not fulfilling certain desires at all, this crucially depends on this fundamental difference in differentiation between short-term and long-term consequences. And a rational person is a person, in this sense, is a person who can see beyond short-term consequences and see the long-term consequences. And that's what Imam Ghazali calls awaqibul umur. Can see the long-term consequences of a thing and go beyond the short-term consequences, which are pleasure, or maybe pleasure and satisfaction, and see that long-term, this thing is bad for me, this thing is bad for my body, or this thing is bad for my soul, or this thing is bad in itself. That's why I'm going to put stop to this, or ignore this, or transcend this immediate pleasure and satisfaction, and look for something which is lasting. And that eventually depends on the whole difference between ad-dunya and al-akhirah, because this is the fundamental of Islamic morality is based on this distinction between dunya, this world, and the hereafter. But if you look at the etymology of these things, dunya means anything which is nearer to you, and akhirah means anything which is farther from you. So you can't really have this distinction between short-term and long-term unless you have actually a metaphysical distinction between dunya and akhirah. And that's why, unless you have this metaphysical conception of hereafter, all these distinction between short-term and long-term are basically illusions, in the sense that as Keynes has supposed to have said this, that in the long term we are all dead. So unless you have a concept of akhirah, all the distinction, all the effort to distinguish between short term and long term fundamentally are going to collapse. And we see this, for example, in the world of like utilitarian philosophers make this distinction between short-term utility and long-term utility. And in capitalism, you have this distinction between short-term profits and long-term profits. But if we study the evolution of modern capitalism, you will see that this distinction has collapsed. Why has this collapsed? Because unless you have this distinction is anchored in the metaphysical distinction between dunya and akhirah, these conceptions are not going to go. not going to hold, because every capitalist is a human being and they know that they are going to be dead long term, so they are always going to prefer short term profits over long term profit. And that's one of the basic crises of one of the fundamental crises of capitalism at the moment. But anyway, I digress. So this is the fourth conception of reason which Imam Ghazali is going to talk about, and I basically explained it. Now we are going to go back to the text and see if there is anything we have left.